Hi, this presentation will look at the poem Oysters, which is the first poem in Seamus Heaney's collection Fieldwork, which was published in 1979. This particular collection is arguably a political collection that reflects on the troubles in Ireland at the time. Heaney in the past was criticised for not being political enough, although Morrison argued that the poems are directly about the Troubles as well as elegies for friends and acquaintances. And in the final slide of this particular presentation, you'll see a link to the Poetry Foundation website, which offers a biography of Seamus Heaney. And you can use that when you're writing about poems in your actual exam to bring in the other readings of Seamus Heaney's poetry, which is quite a clever way of doing that. Remember that when we look at a poem, the first thing that we focus on is the actual title itself. And in this particular case, we have oysters, and we know that oysters are seen as an aphrodisiac. So there's this overtone of fertility that's perhaps running through the poem itself, and this sexual overtone or undertone. The other way of looking at it is to see the oysters as representing the iconoclastic notions of the religious and political overtones that were dominating Ireland at the time when this was written. Oysters as well are often found on the southern coast of Ireland, so there is this association, in places, for example, such as Cork, they have oyster festivals. So there is this link as well to Ireland and the Irish people. Ireland has a history of colonisation dating back to the Normans, over 1,000 years ago. And the reason why Ireland was colonised is because of the minerals and agriculture that it offered, and also the trade routes as well. And that colonisation has been a very physical and violent struggle, and that can be seen as symbolised in Heaney's poem Oysters, with the actual oyster itself. If you think of the way in which you would get to the oyster, that culinary process could be quite a violent act with the knife and prizing open of the shell, and therefore that's symbolic of the troubles in Ireland and the violent history that Ireland has. So you've got this fertility, but to get to that fertile land is through a very violent act. Stanza 1 begins with the collective pronoun, our shells clacked on the plates, my tongue was a filling estuary. So one of the first things that you'd notice is the onomatopoeic words that are used throughout this particular stanza, with the use of the words clacked, so we can actually hear the sound of the eating of the oysters. We also have this metaphor that's being used with my tongue was a filling estuary, so you can imagine that salty water filling onto the tongue. And obviously that's linked to the eating of the oysters, but there is also this reference to a sexual act between a man and a woman. And you could almost see that throughout the whole poem. If you look for it, you can see that interpretation. And there may be a number of ways of doing that. It could just be that it's describing this relationship between a man and a woman, or it could be seeing the relationship between Ireland and the coloniser, this uneasy marriage that has taken place between the two. And then we have my palate hung with starlight as I tasted the salty Pleiades. Orion dipped his foot into the water. Now you can see on the image on the actual PowerPoint itself this collection of stars, the constellations, which are Pleiades. And they were 7 sisters who were immortalised by Zeus in the constellation itself to escape Orion, who is pursuing them. So we can see this symbolism of the pursuer and the pursued. And there they've rested in this very beautiful constellation in the stars. We also have obviously the sea imagery, and as you know, water and the seas are often related as well to fertility. So if we consider as well the women who are set in the constellation of Taurus, there's this idea of being pursued and fertility, and as we've said already in the title, with the reference to the fertile land. And in being pursued, there is something quite savage about that. So if you take this idea of Orion, who's pursuing these females, you could link that to the Europe's imperialist history as well, of being, of pursuing fertile lands. In the second stanza, very violent imagery is used throughout. So we have the use of the word violated. And then if you look down at the fifth line, this ripped and shucked and scattered, again with these onomatopoeic words. And also shucked is a term that is used, that is associated with eating oysters. So there's this extended idea here. Alive and violated, they lay on their beds of ice, bivalves the split bulb. So bivalves are molluscs that have a tight shell, so you can see there on the image that I've used. And philandering sigh of ocean. And so philandering sigh of ocean, they'll never meet the ocean again. So there's this sigh of the ocean. And I suppose there are many different ways of interpreting this final line, millions of them ripped and shucked and scattered. So there's a reference itself to the way in which Ireland has been colonised in a very violent way, with these violent verbs, ripped and shucked and scattered. You could also relate that, I suppose, to the Irish people, who, as the result of colonisation, have been themselves scattered, amongst the world, having to leave Ireland because of colonisation. I also wonder if you take the image of the oyster, where it talks about this split bulb and philandering sigh of ocean. I also wonder if that could be the split between the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland as well. So there's another way of looking at it. So not only the island being opened and split in that very violent act, but also the split that's occurred in Ireland between the Northern Ireland and the Republic. Many critics have also argued that the ocean as well is related to natural power, but also Heaney could be making a reference here to the god ocean, and which relates to the fertility of the seas and the erosion of the coast. In stanza 3, we have again this idea of perhaps a relationship, whether that be a friendship or a marriage perhaps. We're driven to that coast through flowers and limestone. So if we take flowers to be representative of romance, limestone as well, there's a link there to agriculture again, because often limestone was used to fertilise soil. And there we were toasting friendship, laying down a perfect memory in the cool of thatch and crockery. And thatch and crockery here to represent perhaps the outside world. And we could link this to the idea of a cementing perhaps of a relationship. Perhaps this is cementing a relationship between Ireland and the British. And perhaps in this collection, Heaney does explore obviously the political relationship between the British and the Irish. But if we're also picking up on, as we had before, with this relationship, this marriage, and perhaps this idea, this relationship is being used as a symbol for the relationship between the Irish and the British. In this stanza, perhaps this idea of guilt is explored. If we consider in the third stanza, it talked about this relationship, this uneasy marriage that's formed between the British and the Irish. But here, over the Alps packed deep in hay and snow, the Romans hauled their oysters south to Rome. Now, famously, the Romans were great colonisers. But if we consider the Romans here to relate to the English and south to Rome to relate to London, which was the epicentre of modern empire, then here we have the English sending the fertile agriculture of Ireland back to London, and it's preserved in this brine stung. We preserve fish, for example, in brine. So again, it's that image that's being extended, the extended metaphor of the poem as well. And it relates as well to the brine-stung glut of privilege. And here we have as well that you can actually hear that language, the brine-stung glut of privilege, and the use of sound in those particular words, with the repetition of the I in brine and the U in stung, and then the glut in privilege, that assonance is almost making it sound as if it's spilling over. So if you imagine that filling estuary that we had in the first stanza, and here it's almost as if it's spilling over. There's something quite gluttonous and disgusting about that image, but that glut of privilege that's being preserved by the British, raping and taking what they want and then sending it back to profit London, to profit the English. So there's, it seems as if it's initially that it's relating to the speaker of the poem who's just consuming oysters, but actually it's relating to this the greed of the British. From stanza 4 into stanza 5, we have the use of enjambment here with the front-lipped brine-stung glut of privilege and was angry that my trust could not repose. And I think the anger is the anger felt by the Irish people who didn't act, who failed to do something. And this idea is explored in some of Heaney's other poems as well. I think it's the Tomb Road, where he writes about how people didn't do anything. The whole country was sleeping, he makes reference to in the Tomb Road. And I think here that anger that you have, where it makes reference to the glut of the English, then relates to the anger that is felt by the Irish people who trusted too much. And here Heaney makes reference to the poetry and freedom leaning in from sea. I ate the day deliberately, that its tang might quicken me all into verb, pure verb. And I think here is this idea of seizing the day, of being moved into verb, pure verb, is action, isn't it? Being moved to do something. And I think that's quite significant for Heaney. If you think of if you take the poem Digging, where Heaney makes reference to how he's going to use his pen in order to make comment, to have action, to write about the Irish people, to write about the struggles in Ireland. And I think this is a similar thing. And it's quite interesting that this particular poem then comes, is placed at the beginning of the collection, as he then goes on to discuss the troubles in Ireland and elegies for people who've died. And so therefore Heaney himself, and remember we made reference before about how he has been criticised, or was criticised, for not doing enough. But actually, I think in this particular collection of field work, he is actually making, writing a political message, taking a political stand, where he's writing really quite explicitly in some places about the violence that's experienced by many Irish people in Ireland. Giving voices to particular people. If you take, for example, the poem in memory of Francis Ledwidge, relating to an Irishman who fought during the war and then lost his voice and who he was, and is commemorated in an English memorial, and yet Heaney claims him back as an Irishman. And I think this particular poem, Oysters, is actually making reference to the way in which perhaps Heaney himself, or the speaker of the poem, is going to be moved into action, and how this particular collection itself is overcast by the dark Irish history and conflict that's been experienced by Ireland. In this particular presentation, I made reference to an article that you can find on poetryfoundation.org, and you can see a link to that particular article there. By reading articles such as this, it's going to help you on the second question in your exam with two of the assessment objectives. So AO3, which is demonstrate understanding of the significance and influence of the context in which literary texts are written and received. And also for AO5, which is explore literary texts informed by different interpretations. So when, for example, you make reference to Heaney has been criticised in the past for not being political enough, however, in your opinion, etc., or in the critic's opinion, you're bringing in other readings. But remember, what you need to do in your exam is you need to signpost that you are bringing in different interpretations. And you either do that by actually making reference to a particular critic, although that may be quite difficult under examination conditions to actually remember those critics, and it might cause exam stress by trying to remember them, or you say alternatively, on the other hand, and use those signpost phrases that we've made reference to in the past. Okay, thank you.